PSI Journal Club webinar. So in terms of housekeeping, we'll be recording the webinar today and we ask non-presenters to go on mute, please. If you have questions during the seminar, please post the question in the question box. We'd like to thank Wiley, our sponsors, who are making the papers we're discussing today freely available to access for 4 weeks. And I'll hand you over to our chair, Vladimir Anisimov, to start the meeting. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to everybody who attended this seminar. Today we have two distinguished speakers, Mike O'Kelly from Inquia, it's former Quintiles, and Carl Frederick Burman is from AstraZeneca. And they will cover two papers on the topic of modeling and simulation. And these topics were published in Pharmaceutical Statistics in two journals in 2017 and 2011. And you can find this on your webpage. The first speaker is Michael O'Kelly. Mike is a principal scientific advisor with Inquia Advisory Services Analytics. Mike is a member of PSI Modeling and Simulation Special Interest Group. And this group proposed best practice document for project involving modeling and simulation, and it was accepted by PSI board in 2017. Mike used simulation for modeling various characteristics of clinical trials. He also has given presentations and training on this subject at PSI events, and his other main statistical interest is in missing data. Last year, Mike received the PSI RSS Award for Excellence in Pharmaceutical Statistics for his work in both missing data and best practice. So, Mike, pleasure to have you here. Over to you.
Thanks, Vlad. So let's go to the presentation. So this webinar is to cover the PSI journal article, Proposed Best Practice for Projects that Involve Modeling and Simulation. And the authors are myself, Vlad Anisimov, who you've just heard and who chairs this meeting, Chris Campbell, and Sinead Hamilton. So I'll, in this talk about the paper, based on the paper, I'll cover some history of attempts to come up with best practice in modeling and simulation. Then I'll try to cover the core of the paper with key points to consider about best practice. And then a very informal survey of the state of the art, as it were, in modeling and simulation at the moment with regard to best practice. Very informal and by no means definitive, but just to give us an idea of how things are really done at the moment. So our attempt in the PSI Special Interest Group was not the first by any means to come up with good practice in modeling and simulation. And there's a quite well-known paper in 1999 with some extremely well-known authors, which proposed a best practice or good practices for simulation in drug development. And right then up at 2011, the European Medicines Agency, EMA, and the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, FPA, convened a workshop on modeling and simulation, which included a lot of talk about best practice in modeling and simulation. So right through that period, people have been thinking about this. A particular paper that we found particularly helpful was one by Smith and Marshall in 2010 on the importance of protocols, or as we think of them, specifications for simulation studies. And we certainly drew heavily on that in our proposal for best practice. There's also been a nice paper by a DIA adaptive design group, a paper whose primary author is Brenda Gaidos, which covered some nice points about the kinds of things you should expect in a simulation report, and also suggestions about the kind of scenarios you should have in a simulation. And also Carl Friedrich Bormann and colleagues, Carl Friedrich is a second speaker at this webinar, has published a number of papers. There are 2 of them, both from pharmaceutical statistics. That second one there was produced as part of an initiative of the PSI Special Interest Group. I should be referring to FSPI actually, because the Special Interest Group for Modeling and Simulation is a Europe-wide one, and it comes under the auspices of FSPI. It's one of those special interest groups. Okay, so going back to that first attempt, I had the opportunity to talk to some of the people involved in that first attempt to come up with good practice, and they were telling me that there actually was a lot of fairly heated argument in the group that tried to come up with the best practice. And that was interesting to me because it reflected some of the argument that we had ourselves. And you could think of it, broadly speaking, in terms of kind of 2 directions in the drive to scientific practice. I think of these as the 2 drives as something like this. You've got this kind of orderly, the drive to orderly accumulation of evidence with control of false positive findings, lots of predefined endpoints and so on. I probably incline towards this drive more myself, but just as valuable, I think, is the more imaginative and creative drive in science, where you just try out things, you are open to new ideas, and you're not so worried about proving anything, at least in the first instance. And you could say very crudely that those equally valuable drives are found in the 2 disciplines of pharmacometrics and pharmaceutical statistics, with the pharmacometrics being the more creative side. Professor Stephen Zen has nicely encapsulated the differences in a paper where he suggests that pharmacometrics is explanatory in purpose, theory-based and optimistic in attitude. Its approach to modeling is biologically knowledgeable, and its view of causality is mechanistic, while pharmaceutical statistics is pragmatic in approach, empirical in method, and skeptical and pessimistic in attitude, with its approach to modeling biologically innocent, and its view of causality is voluntary. So that pharmaceutical statistics is really saying, come on, prove it to me, whereas pharmacometrics is the drive there is to really try and generate hypotheses and to look at possibilities, as it were. So with those 2 different drives being very much around for different uses of modeling and simulation, can such diverse uses, and those aren't the only divergences, can those various uses of modeling and simulation be covered by a single best practice? Well, that question came up also at that workshop I mentioned, convened by EMA and FPA, the industry body. And there's a nice clip there on YouTube where Bob Hemmings of EMA summarizes another aspect of the variety of uses of modeling and simulation. He notes that there are different uses of modeling and simulation differ in terms of their impact on decision making, and argues that there may well be different standards applicable in terms of good practice for different exercises, depending on, say, whether they're low, medium, or high impact. He was, I guess, primarily thinking of the regulatory point of view, but it's true also of internal decision making, I think. And he noted that the detail of regulatory response might vary according to the impact of the modeling and simulation results. At that workshop, Bob Hemmings explicitly made a call for industry to come up with a best practice. And the special interest group, of course, felt they'd better do something about that, and they were particularly anxious to incorporate that notion of the variety of uses of modeling and simulation, and yet some kind of unifying best practice that would cover them all. At the same time, FPA, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, started the MID3 initiative. MID3 stands for Model-Informed Drug Discovery and Development, to encourage the integration of modeling and simulation into the development process, and also to describe good practice. And they published a comprehensive paper in 2006. Meanwhile, the PSI SIG tried to come up with some kind of working best practice for statisticians from the principle it came up with, trying to keep things simple, was that the core of best practice has to be in the specification. If a specification is provided and includes elements that could be regarded as key and which we could propose as necessary for best practice, then we felt that this would go a long way towards encouraging best practice in projects involving modeling and simulation. The idea was to allow for flexibility. The idea was to require all key elements to be included in specification, or alternatively for the specification itself to justify why key elements are not included. Likewise, the specification in our proposal was required to justify the level of detail which was contained in that specification itself. So some projects that might be once-off and might take only half a day to implement would require a very high level of specification, and the specification itself could explain that and justify the low level of justification and pre-specification that applied. Part of what the SIG did was to have an early discussion with European Medicines Agency on what they might expect from a best practice. And the notes that came back from that meeting contained almost no surprises. Things like pre-specification, clear description of the analysis, checks of assumptions, clear statement of the results that would be presented, and sensitivity analyses. The one note that did come from that meeting that mightn't be assumed by everyone was that conclusions of simulation should be robust to missing data. Okay, so just to give a little bit more of the background to how we went about to proposing the best practice, I'm just flashing up there some parts of that paper by Smith and Marshall, and you can see just from the headings, it might be worth having a look at the slides afterwards. Just the headings themselves cover a lot of the key points mentioned in that EMA meeting and are echoed in our own proposal. So similarly, that paper on adaptive clinical trials, I mentioned that it has some nice points about what should be contained in a simulation report. So we had a lot of previous work to profit by. Just some brief notes about the paper itself. It was authored by volunteers from the Special Interest Group. Special Interest Group members come from a variety of pharmaceutical companies, but in fact, all the authors of the best practice document come from contract research organizations. Perhaps such organizations have a greater motivation to get involved in these things. And as Vlad mentioned, it was adopted by the best practice was proposed and adopted to the board of PSI and adopted after it was published in Pharmaceutical Statistics. The aim of the best practice document was to define modeling and simulation, which is no easy task, in fact. And while we have attempted to define it, we did find it a very slippery thing to do, because conceptually it's difficult to distinguish between just the predictions that you might come up with in a model, say in terms of a least squared means or something like that, versus true simulation. You could call simulation a collection of predicted values. So we did our best to attempt what distinguishes modeling and simulation from other uses of models. We wanted to lay down some practical guidelines about when to consider using modeling and simulation versus other ways of assessing things. We laid out the elements of a specification for modeling and simulation project, and we covered managing changes to that specification. So I'll cover some of those points now in a little bit more detail. As I mentioned, we were anxious to have something practical that a statistician could have at his or her desk that would really help them to plan and execute any project involving modeling and simulation in a very practical way. So we wanted to keep the paper short. It has those definitions. We declare the scope of the document and its objective. We have an introduction, the project specification. We cover changes to the specification, and we also include in the document, and I urge you to download these as well as the paper itself, 2 templates or examples for specifications for a modeling and simulation project. Our objective here was to make life easy for anyone who did want to come up with a specification for a modeling and simulation project, and we hope that these may do so. A little bit more about those later on. Briefly, some points about the introduction. We cover when to include simulation in a project, look at closed form approaches versus simulation, and we note that a closed form approach should be preferred if it can do the job, but we acknowledge that many projects are such that closed form approaches do not suit. In the course of developing the best practice, it was noted that not everyone really felt that our concentration on the specification made sense. So we've included a justification or why we think a specification is central to best practice. And our thesis is that it really helps both at all stages of a project. Before the project even properly begins, if a specification is drafted, we feel it enables users to answer in advance the question, well, will this project actually answer my research question? And in many people's experience, I think many of us will have experience of elaborate modeling and simulation projects which end up not actually answering the question of interest. So specification should help with that. It also, as many people testify, encourages the dialogue between the statisticians and those whom they serve, often say clinicians or project managers, which usually ends up greatly improving the focus of the project. While the project is going on, then of course the specification enables team members to act consistently to achieve the planned outputs. And when the project is over, a specification really helps whoever is running or sponsoring the project to assess whether indeed the project achieved its goals. So right through from start to end and before and after that, specification really helps with best practice in our experience. Then to go to the project specification itself, I'll simply list the key items that we came up with, which are very similar to those mentioned by EMA. We recommend this in a kind of executive summary. The introduction should include clinical statistical background, a clear statement of objectives. And what might be controversial for some is we recommend that some criteria for conclusions should be stated, or if they're not stated, then a justification should be given for their omission. That leans towards that hypothesis testing aspect of modeling and simulation. It may not suit everyone's taste, but we felt it was worth considering in every project. With regard to the simulation and the analysis or design that was to be looked at via the simulation, a clear statement of scenarios assumed and assumptions made, including sensitivity analyses, is a key element. The data set should be described, the analysis should be described, and what's less common in the specifications that we've seen, the operating characteristics should be estimated in terms of the numbers of simulations planned. Finally, a section on logistics is recommended. That's things like the execution environment, the location of the programming code, and so on. Okay, then for the next, I'll just cover briefly the aspect of the specification which includes quality control and presentation of results. With regard to quality control, we wanted to keep to this idea of matching the impact of the particular project for which modeling and simulation is used. So appropriate level of QC should be planned, and that could depend upon the estimated impact of the project, and we give certain examples to help people to estimate the impact. And it could vary from, say, a simple review of the specification alone for a low impact project to perhaps independent programming of the entire project for some high impact projects. With regard to presentation results, a number of people have realized that the results of a modeling and simulation project could be presented to a variety of audiences, and it's recommended to plan in advance the outputs for each audience. Use of confidence intervals is recommended, and we have some recommendations about how to manage changes to the specification. So the overall principle is to do what's necessary for best practice, but not more. And our aim was to allow the flexibility necessary for best practice in an area where the regulatory and scientific importance of projects varies widely. So we would urge you to take advantage of this period where the paper is freely downloadable, not just for members of PSI, but for everyone, to get a copy, and we urge you to make use of it in your projects. And hopefully, we believe that this will improve the practice of modeling and simulation projects, and may encourage the regulator to in their reviews of such projects, the idea being that a standard set of outputs as recommended or as specified and recommended would be available to them. Here I just give a picture of the two template specifications we provide. One was for a low impact project, and you can see that it's relatively short and simple. And then we also provide a template or example specification for a high impact project, which contains a lot more detail, more justification of assumptions, more calculations about likely variance due to the number of simulations and so on. Right, very briefly then, I just want to give you an idea of existing practice, just as a kind of a stimulus to further thought about best practice. And forgive me if I don't cover the details of this very informal survey in full, but you can check them out in the in the slides. But so briefly then, in that very comprehensive and useful paper by the mid-3 group, by Marshall and others, they assembled a list of 103 publications with references there that involved modeling and simulation. And I took a random sample of 48 of these and ended up with 29 usable ones, 23 journal papers and 6 slide sets were what were found in that random sample. And I rather arbitrarily took about 20 odd points of best practice, looking at the points made by the mid-3 group whose paper I'm quoting here, and our own paper, just to see from my purely subjective judgment how many of the key elements were present in these papers. No criticism is meant of the papers, it's simply a look at the practice as we have it at the moment. So the first set of attributes I looked at was the more general ones of planning and presentation, 13 items, and here are the percentages I found in those 29 papers. Things like statement of objective and clinical background and the input data and model assumptions were fairly well covered, 90% in all cases. Perhaps striking items not included were only 2 papers included a formal statement of criteria for any conclusion made in the paper, which probably reflects the quite wide use of modeling and simulation for exploratory and hypothesis generation work rather than hypothesis testing. And that may also be reflected in the relatively low number of papers, 8 just out of the 29, that included sensitivity analyses. Although as a kind of compensation, about half the papers did describe the limitations of whatever method was being or design was being assessed. And then again, forgive the speed of this this short presentation on the survey. I looked at some more technical attributes, 8 items here, and found that a relatively low rate of inclusion of items that were felt to be quite useful, if not important, in best practice. So in just about 2/3 of cases was the software used stated, with the version only given in half. Technical things like the seed was almost never given. That's perhaps less surprising in a peer-reviewed publication where such technical details might be seen as out of place. But it was disappointing slightly that in only 4 of the 29 papers was programming code made available. Stephen Zen has often noted the importance of including a measure of simulation uncertainty, and there was a disappointing number of papers that included that, just 5 out of the 29. On the positive side, more than half the papers did include confidence intervals in their result. A fairly low percentage included any measure of type 1 error or power bias, and that probably then again goes with the use of modeling and simulation at least as much for hypothesis generation as for hypothesis testing. Okay, that concludes my summary of the paper and just a look at some of the issues surrounding that. Now I'd like to hand the presentation over to Carl Friedrich Bormann.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. I just would like to remind all attendees that you can write questions on this chat panel. I have it from the left of seminar, but probably you can see it somewhere, chat panel. Well, so First, I would like to mention also that, as already Michael told, that closed form solution, if it's available, then definitely it's more efficient to use analytic solutions compared to simulation. However, it might be a situation that even if you have analytic solution, sometimes you can use Monte Carlo simulation to verify different analytic formulas and algorithms, especially if formulas are very complicated, and it would be good to check them on critical bounds, near bounds. Well, now we are coming to the second presentation by Carl Friedrich Burcham, or CAFFE for short. CAFFE is working in AstraZeneca methodology group and mainly is dealing with design, consultations, and oncology modeling. He has been working in pharma industry since 1995, and from the latest 90s, he was collaborating with pharmacometricians. CAFFE had some disagreeing standpoints, which led to some articles on modeling and simulation. And in 2005, he received the PSI Best Paper Award, and in 2011, PSI Poster Award. It's a pleasure, CAFFE, to have you here. Over to you, please.
Thank you very much. Do you see my slides all right?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about modeling and simulation, an intriguing subject. And thanks to PSI and pharmaceutical statistics to give me space to publish these kind of ideas. But Vlad was saying, this was coming from my work together with pharmacometricians, and in the late 90s, I felt it was a great hype about clinical trial simulation, or whatever it was called, computer-assisted trial design, and a lot of other names. And it was kind of a reconciliation attempt to write the first paper, which was published in 2005. Screen mode here. And I think that this is summarizing pretty much on a high level my thinking about this. And this was written together with Bengt Hamrén and Per Olsson, two pharmacometricians. Bengt was involved in the FBI summary that Michael was talking about right now. And what we're saying already in the abstract here is that it's a bit go back to basic, that there is not much more to modeling and simulation than applying standard old methods of modeling, statistics, and decision theory. However, doing this in a good way could give great benefits to the industry. When I was looking at this was at 2005, the first paper coming out, and then a couple of years later, the working group wanted an update. So that was the background for the work together with Johan Wiklund. And at that time, Johan was the global modeling and simulation lead at AstraZeneca statistics. And we were setting out to try to define a common ground. What could modeling and simulation be to a statistics department? And shortly after that, his site was closed, and he was leaving the company. Sadly, he's still having some thinking about these kind of things as a consultant or associated to a consultancy company. When looking at this this advertisement for our presentation, I noticed that at the when I looked at this, at the lower left part, we had an announcement for a head of statistical modeling and simulation for AstraZeneca. So if you think that my views on simulation and modeling are great, then do apply for the job of head of modeling and simulation at AstraZeneca. And if you think that if you totally disagree, then of course you should come here to train us better. So we set out, the Johan Wiklund and I, in 2011 to formulate 7 theses about good modeling. And I think it's important to understand that modeling means a lot of different things to different people. So EMA is talking about modeling and what they would like to see in modeling. We have the regulatory purposes. We have the payer purposes, which is completely different. Not completely, but quite different. And to me, modeling is pretty much about making internal decisions. Pharmacometricians are having a rather different attitude. And Michael, perhaps you can answer later on in the summary about modeling examples, are they typically coming from a pharmacometrics world, or what kind of modeling are they really thinking about? So to me, it's very important to have the right focus in a modeling work, and that means starting to understand what is the decision, why are we doing this, in what way could the work we're doing with modeling and simulation change something, the design of a trial, the regulatory decision, the pay decision, or whatever. But then I have to ask myself, this was the advice we were giving a couple of years ago, but am I really following this myself? So right now it's very hot in the industry with immuno-oncology drugs. There are a couple of trials where the relative efficacy, the hazard ratio, does not seem to be the same over time. So we have non-proportional hazards. So I'm really interested in trying to model what will the hazard ratio be over time. But why would I do that? What's really the decision behind that? And I can think about some decisions that could be influenced, but I think it's also for me something to think about, well, why are we really doing this? And modeling should not just be a nice to have thing, it should change a clear decision. There are a lot of different application areas, and to me this is very much about investment decisions internally. And the most standard thing of this, which many pharmaceutical statisticians are working with routinely, will be trial design. So how should we design trials? How should we set up a multiplicity procedure? And that depends on what we would like to achieve, what we believe, and what we believe is their modeling is coming in and helping us to set up perhaps a Bayesian prior to get frequentist properties, expected power, or assurance. So this slide is just summarizing that there are an awful lot of different types of models, modeling, and I think we should try to have this broad view, that be clear about, are we talking about modeling in general, or do we talk about a particular sort of modeling? And people tend to think that pharmacometrician may think that everything is about nonlinear mixed effect models, and you're using a standard model to put something in, and you may in health economics have a standard package of extrapolations, but of course modeling could be so much more than that. Related to this focus on decisions is that modeling should be driven by the underlying question. So in physics, we are using completely different theories, or quite different theories, depending on what kind of technology we're developing or what kind of questions we're answering. And typically we're using the standard old Newton mechanics, but when the velocity is close to the speed of light, then Einstein is kicking in, and then we're looking at tiny things, then it's quantum mechanics. For us, it's something similar, looking, for example, about what to do with covariates. So in the standard regulatory question about is this drug effective, then it's rather simple to handle covariates. Perhaps you don't have to handle them. Perhaps it's putting them into a standard ANCOVA model. If the question is trying to identify which set of patients that really benefit from the drug, then it's getting much more complicated. It could be one covariate, and then it's rather manageable. But there are a number of different techniques. There could be more exploratory, that there are a lot of different covariates, and we aren't really sure about what could be important here. And so the question is changing, and the techniques of solving, of attacking the modeling exercise will be quite different. And we could have questions about dynamic treatment regimes and how things are developing covariates and responses over time. So, for example, in diabetes, you could have a short-term model about how insulin and glucose and other things food exercise relate to each other. So perhaps a set of differential equations. It could also be something about what's happening over many years, and in which order should we give the different drugs or treatments. And this is hand-drawn because I don't want you to believe that I really understand much about this. But I'm thinking that the blue curve is insulin. So before getting diabetes, the insulin levels goes up. This is negative time in the scale here. And then somewhere the pancreatic beta cells will not be able to produce enough insulin to get the glucose levels in order. So glucose, the red curve, is starting to get increase. And then at a certain time point, you're diagnosed with diabetes, you get the first drug, A, and the glucose levels are going down. Insulin is continuing slowly downwards. You have some kind of control, but you have a long-term effect where the beta cells are burnt out. And meanwhile, the body weight, the green curve, is increasing, but not very fast. So then when drug A wears out, you add a new drug, and this drug is targeting insulin. So the insulin levels are increasing now for a while, before beta cells are even more burnt out and it starts to fall down. The glucose levels, the red curve, are going down for a while, but then starting to rise. And because of more insulin, the body weight will increase much faster in this part. So eventually, the doctor will switch you from B to C, which is a drug which is having a completely different mechanism of action. It's not increasing insulin levels, but so insulin is going down, but it's doing something with eliminating sugar and helping with body weight. So then we could have a lot of modeling about in which order should different drugs be given. The third thesis is that modeling should be applied on be based on applied science. And then a bit controversial, I would say that statistical theory is not science. Statistics is something much better than this. Statistics is part of the means where we can understand reality, the experiments made in science. So that means that we as statisticians are rather philosophers than scientists. We have to try to understand real problem, and typically we cannot really, we don't have all the expertise ourselves, so we need to go out to talk to people that have a deeper understanding. But they don't typically know so much about quantitative thinking, modeling, and that means that we need to find this kind of common ground and reformulate our questions and trying to understand each other. And that means that means a lot of interactions with bioscientists, but depending on the problem, perhaps it's more about the investment parts. So it's about marketing models and how to include that, or looking at what is the probability of technical success based on bioscience assumptions, but also looking at what is the target product profile and who has been formulating this. Is this really exactly what you should be using in the model? So a bit of trying to question some of the assumptions. The network meter example I will mostly skip, but the idea here is that it's perhaps not just putting the data, find the data, put it in a standard software. It's a bit about thinking about why do we have these trials? Could there be differences between them? Modeling uses a lot of different information sources, and there are different types of statisticians, and pharmaceutical statisticians have traditionally tended to be quite conservative, whereas if you as a statistician is working on health technology assessment, you have to be much more pragmatic. And if you as a statistician work with data mining or in other fields than pharma, then your attitudes could be quite different. And I think we can learn a bit from each other and realize that we don't always have good data. So I was attending PSI's excellent course on health technology assessments this week. And they were, especially perhaps Anja Schill, being a regulator and payer, she was stressing that payers have to be pragmatic. You have to make a decision. If you have good data or bad data, you have to do the best of the situation. So in many cases, we don't have what we would like to have in terms of data. So we have to make assumptions, and we can go back to preclinical data, competitor data, observational data, real world evidence, and trying to put that together to cover different fields, different parts of the model that we have to build. And an important thing in this is expert elicitation, to talk to the experts and helping them to elicit and bring their knowledge into what we can be using as quantitative assumptions. So go get your hands get dirty. You have to get involved in making these assumptions. Be as transparent as possible, but assumptions are needed, and trying to be objective isn't really a way forward in many cases of modeling. We shouldn't complicate things too much. So Anja again was saying that payers love simplicity. Regulators typically don't like pharmacometric type of model because it involves a lot of assumptions. So back to the old randomized clinical trials, we could go with a minimum set of assumptions and we could get firm results. But then it's complicating, things are getting more and more complicated. So we end up with looking at subgroups, and then it's not that clear that we have for comparing, we have treatment switching problems and whatever, and even in the regulatory statistical world we need assumptions and models. So we have in the paper, we say that the man with a hammer, for a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And I think I see this over and over again, that people tend to use the tools that they know well, and they don't really try to see the whole picture. And this we can see with pharmacometrics. We've seen a large surge in pharmacometrics, so many more pharmacometricians being involved, many of them coming from statistics. And I think they could help the industry in tremendously. But there's a risk that a pharmacometrician will work with standard pharmacometrics models and don't really see that sometimes something else is needed. There are other assumptions, or you can simplify this, or you have a regulatory purpose, a confirmatory purpose where you perhaps could use the pharmacometrics model to see where we should measure the patients, how we could evade the responses, but getting away from as many assumptions as possible. The new hype, of course, is about data science, much broader than the old hypes about pharmacometrics and adaptive designs. So data science, we're talking about all over the society. And I think it's a bit the same there. It's great, but do they really have an understanding all the time? Or are they trying to understand what the models are really saying? It's a risk of getting too much of a standard toolkit. So how about us statisticians? Oh, same thing. We have a tendency to know a way of analyzing data, and we stick to that. To try to look at what others are doing, try to look at what experts could say, and how a diversity of data sources could be used. There's a standard economics law of diminishing return, and I think this is often applied to applicable to modeling. And I would say that in many cases you can do a good model in an hour. So I would like to get this modeling attitude out among drug developers. It doesn't have to be complicated. It's putting the information together to find a conclusion to change the decision. Modeling is a continuous process, and this was something that we emphasized already in the abstract I showed you from 2005, where we gather data, we build mathematical models, we're predicting what will happen from them by simulation or other techniques, and we try to optimize designs, for example. But then designing a clinical trial, we get more data. So we are continuing the data gathering and can refine the models, etc. And looking at external data, new papers are coming in, new questions are asked, and you can go around in this learning loop along with your drug development through the stages. The last thing about modeling is that it facilitates communication. And now it's my definition of modeling. And this is that modeling is to translate the real problem into mathematics. And then the key process of after solving it more in a quantitative sphere, give it back to the decision makers in a digestible format, so they are helped by this. That this isn't a black box. So we're going from the black to rather probing light on the problem. This is one example that I was trying to get as a standard in our design consultancy center within AstraZeneca, which is taking much of my time. And this is a standard template for designing, simulating clinical trials. We are putting up the assumptions, and that's one part. We have the design options, that's one part, and then the operating characteristics, the end result. And then we can compare the different options, and we have transparency in the assumptions going into this. Another question is, are we using this in practice? No, not usually, but at least it's a good framework. We can learn from other areas, so I think that hermeneutics is something to look into. This is used in literature and biology. But to us, it's about zooming in and zooming out, that you have to work in your small world, in your small model sometimes, but you need to see the greater context. So, simulation. I'm not an expert in simulation. I'm not running a lot of simulations. I don't have the time for this. But I'm a bit puzzled by a lot of people feeling that they are great experts in simulation, and still they haven't been looking in a book about simulations. So there's some kind of tendency of having a very simplistic view of simulations. The first, Vlad was talking about that the best thing is not to use simulation. Use closed form solutions, numeric integration, which is pretty much what simulation typically is about, integrating, using approximations. And that simulations could help in that process. So if I'm trying to derive a result, I'm often using simulations to check that I'm thinking correctly. And in many cases, you can do some approximations, some numeric calculations, and then you have to add simulations. And you may think that we can run 10 million of simulations nowadays, and sometimes we can, but too many people are getting into complicated problems where they are simulating individual data and doing a lot of stuff in each and every trial, and then having 1,000 observations, 1,000 trials to get the power is kind of what the computers can handle. And this will not do. You have to give confidence intervals. That was on Michael's list. You need to understand the uncertainty. And if you run into these problems, please try to check variance reducing technique. FDA has a new work on complex innovative designs, so I think it's useful to look at their slides on simulations. So thank you very much. Now over to you, Vlad.
Okay, thank you very much, Kaffi. Well, until we are waiting questions, just to add that I completely agree with Kathy about these remarks on simulation. And I would like to add that, of course, for now very complicated real-world problems, it may not be possible always to find good analytic solutions, but it can be used very efficiently combined, so-called combined analytic simulation technique, when you can create or construct the whole model as some blocks combined with themselves in some way. And for example, for some blocks or for some steps of solution, you can use analytical technique and calculate rather fast parameters of these steps, of these blocks. And then altogether, you can use simulation to get the solution of the whole problem. Okay, I would like to remind to put questions in the chat panel. And for now, to start discussion, I would like to ask a couple of comments to Mike. And you mentioned in your talk, Mike, that European Federation and pharmaceutical industry and associations also prepared a paper on good practice. Can you tell a bit more about working with this team and what are the relations to compare with our paper on best practice?
Sure, Vlad. It wasn't perhaps the ideal turn of events that it turned out that a mid-3 group and our own group both were trying to think about best practice, and the communication between the two groups was not optimal. But when we did learn about each other's work, we have got together and we've now presented, I think, 2 or 3 sessions, one of them at PSI, I think the year before last, together. And as it mightn't be surprising, the key elements in a specification, both groups came up with more or less pretty much the same key elements. So an advantage of there being 2 groups working on best practice and coming up with similar key items, I think, is that the PSI group kind of covers the interests of the professional statistician, and then the FPA, the industry-sponsored mid-3 group, worked hard at getting buy-in from a wide range of companies. So I think between the two, our hope is that we've made best practice more likely to be done both from the professional point of view and from the point of view of buy-in from industry. We've also produced a short paper together. Yes, sorry, card reading.
Michael, I did recognize some names on the FPL work, and those names are from pharmacometrics or from regulatory affairs. Do you know if there were any statisticians involved?
I'm not familiar enough with that group to be sure about that, but I think there were some, although I think my impression was the slant was towards that the pharmacometric uses of modeling and simulation, but I think all uses were fairly adequately covered in their paper in the end. But yes, the slant was towards the pharmacometric side, I think. And you could say that the slant of the PSI paper is more towards pharmaceutical statistics type of use of modeling and simulation, which I think is more what you covered as well. In fact, I was going to ask you, would you characterize different uses? You've had experience both in pharmacometrics and in design of clinical trials. Would you characterize different best practices in those 2 groups? Or different practice even?
Yes, I think that people are thinking very differently if they're coming from different areas. I don't think that we should think differently. I think we have to adapt to the problems that we're trying to use, and of course we should use what we're good at, but ideally then, if you have different competencies, you should try to work together. Mm-hmm. And I recall many years ago, I was sitting at a meeting with a number of rather high-level managers, and they were coming from statistics and pharmacometrics, and perhaps some other areas, and they were talking on this high level on modeling and simulation for, I don't know, 2 hours or something. And I was sitting there listening and feeling that they are talking about different things. They don't really understand what the other people are meaning when they are saying modeling. So I think that your attempt to define what do we mean by modeling and simulation, that's really great. And I agree that it's quite difficult already from the beginning to say, well, what do we mean by these words and what is included?
Thanks. Yes, and I wouldn't say we'd come up with the ultimate definition of modeling and simulation. It was just an attempt, because it's a very slippery thing to try to define. But it is susceptible, as you say, of different emphases.
Well, okay. I see a few questions online. One is a very interesting question related mainly to testing or choosing the right model and model verification. So the question, the technique arising from data science is to partition data into training and testing sets to prevent overfitting. This is not a standard practice in modeling simulation space. Can the author share their opinion on this practice, and when it's appropriate and when it's not necessarily? Please choose who will answer.
Carl, could you have a go at that? Thanks.
I guess we always have the problem with overfitting, of course. So this is definitely something you have to address when you are as a modeler. Then I think that there are some data science practice which is clashing with basic statistical principles. So as a statistician, I was taught in the basic courses that you have to use all data. That's the sufficiency principle. So of course you can develop methods where you are having a training data set and then so you're dividing your data into different sets. But then you should redo that. So you have different parts of your data set as the initial preliminary data set. So that's the basic statistical principle. I'm not sure if this is always very doable, but it's getting more into bootstrapping techniques and so on. But yes, absolutely, overfitting is a great problem, and I also think that we could be helped by trying to understand what are reasonable models. You know, one very bright idea about those findings was MCP mod, where we can use several different dose response models and analyze the data simultaneously and get some kind of a global test. So I think that's excellent thinking, but couldn't we try to say something about which models should be used or reasonable? So in some cases, we knew from the beginning, you can ask clever pharmacologists, will you have a quadratic dose response? And if that's not even close, like a reasonable approximation, then perhaps you should use other models. So being helped about what's biologically plausible, that can help a lot.
And could I add to that then?
Course, yeah.
There was quite a bit of discussion among the referees for our proposal when submitted to Pharmaceutical Statistics with regard to model checking and validation. And that was interesting to us because we felt that the methodologies used and the thoroughness with which you might go about model checking and validation was such a huge subject that it should be outside the scope of a best practice itself, and we kind of slipped out of the problem that way, that we stated that model checking should be planned and justified. So if you like, we avoided having to answer that question. But just on the point of validation in general, rather than just model checking, there is the point also of checking your scenarios. And that's something that was a bit disappointing in that informal survey of papers, where the variety of scenarios used to check whatever thesis was being explored via the modeling and simulation was generally not great. And we liked one of the principles suggested by that paper by the DIA Adaptive Design Group, which suggested that you should check your simulations using sensitivity analyses that include scenarios, some of which are improbable or extreme, because it's important to know when your methodology that you're simulating, when it breaks down. So that's another, not exactly model checking, but it's another kind of checking of the validity of your simulation model.
And Michael, I think this is a very good idea also to debug the simulation code. That if you go to extreme situation where you know the answer, what's happening then, and you can check proposed test methods and so on. So this is a big concern for FDA, even talking about complex innovative designs. Then go to extreme and say, okay, are you controlling the type 1 error rate or whatever you're interested in? Are you doing this also in extreme situations? And otherwise, well, what's wrong? So they are thinking a lot about, do we need to check all points in the null hypothesis space? And this is pretty much from a regulatory concern about, will a new complex design control the type 1 error rate? In other areas, it may not. It may be completely different questions.
Well, I also would like to add that really this is actually very important and ancient problem. I just, for interest, open Google and put check-in validation models. Several hundreds maybe of different links related to this. And of course, there are a huge number of techniques. Some of them also can be assessed by simulation. Well, so, and also it depends on type of data, I would expect. Probably, really, Mike, we should think, maybe it's, in some sense it should be added, because in clinical trials it's also like accepted practice to check different models, for example, for patient responses using different techniques. So really, well, and of course it cannot be like unique answer. Here I completely agree that with statements that Kaffi told, statistical theory is not a part of science, but part of philosophy of science. And probably it really depends on people who are working in this data and with these trials on their experience and preferences, which techniques to use. And clearly you will never find actually exact proof, never, that this model, yes, it's really fit data. You can only say that this is good model up to a certain extent. For example, like typically up to some probability. Okay, then we have also another question related to modeling simulation. Probably it's to you, Mike. To what extent do you suggest to document simulations performed for use of the site on study design? Is it should be in protocol only? In protocol, only the final decision is typically documented. But should all simulations be documented elsewhere?
Right. This is a difficult one because from one point of view, you should document everything, if only to remind yourself of the number of different hypotheses you've explored via simulation, because there's a kind of an effective multiplicity in any modeling and simulation project. As anyone who's ever done one knows, you end up usually simulating tens, dozens, if not hundreds of variations, for instance, on various scenarios. So I don't think there's I'm sorry to say this, but there isn't a definitive answer here about what you have to document. The only thing is, I would say it's going to be helpful to the practitioner to keep a notebook of all scenarios that have been explored at least, if only to avoid repetition, because I've certainly found myself that I've ended up, if I haven't taken proper notes of all the simulations I've tried out, I've ended up thinking through the same thoughts, having to work through the same thoughts twice or three times, and coming up to the same conclusion twice or three times as a result. So I would say, for best practice, it may not be possible to have full documentation of every single option you ever took in your simulations, but a notebook is a very good idea. And what's best of all in practice, and I think anyone who's tried this out will agree, and it comes up in Cafe's presentation also, is to think through the question you want to answer and the likely scenarios that are actually most highly probable to answer that question or those questions. That's particularly good, not just because it clarifies your thought, but because, as Cafe noted, it brings about that dialogue between the statistician and those who are actually going to use the results of the simulation. So our emphasis in the paper was on thoroughness in documenting the plan of what's to do. But I do think the question does raise a point that in the course of executing that plan, there will almost certainly in practice be several dozen, if not 100, blind alleys which were explored. For those, we haven't really included a documentation of those in the best practice proposal explicitly or fully, but I think just on the basis of experience, we would recommend the keeping of some kind of notebook of those at the least. That's a kind of an imperfect answer. Cafe, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, are you still seeing my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is the example with the template from the design center. I think, to me, how much to document, it's you have to go back to the question about why should you document. And there are a lot of different reasons that you may want to document. The one thing is that when sending this to the project team, that they should get the information they need. And this could be summarized in this kind of template. What are the assumptions? What trial comparisons have we been looking at and would be most important? And what will the operating characteristics be? Then this is often an iterative process. So it could be that that the team is saying, oh, this group sequential design that you have there in the middle, that looks really interesting. However, should we really be as aggressive in futility, could we be more aggressive in futility stopping or winning early or whatever. And then we will go back and look at other group sequential designs and perhaps adding yet another interim analysis. And then we can document what we have been doing and facilitating the communication with the team. But then another thing is that, of course, they want us to be sure about the results. Perhaps it's okay to do some have some bugs, do some errors in early assessments if it's getting reasonably get the same right kind of results. But if this is a really, really important project and it's a huge investment, then we may need to validate the simulation code. And this is one kind of documentation, that the code is well written and readable to someone else, reproducible, and validation perhaps should even be even better based on the assumptions and the totally independent coding procedure. And then you may want to reuse what you have been using in one project for another project. So then you need the documentation to be able to remember what you have been doing, or to leave this to someone else, another modeler working in a similar problem for another project. And then you have the regulatory perspective. So this is the complex innovative designs. Are you controlling the type 1 error? And of course, we need a lot of documentation in that case. So I think it depends a lot on the situation. And in the design center, we had a time where the leader was saying that the standard was to produce a report, and that could be 30 pages. And now we tend to think this is taking far too much time. I have 25 design consultations in a year. Some of them are extremely simple, and we don't really have time to document. But sometimes, of course, it's great to have this documentation. So it's, for me, a case-by-case question.
Okay, thank you. One more question, probably to Michael. What is the difference between a modeling and simulation project and a project that simply makes use of predicted values from a statistical model?
Yeah, I wish I had the text of our paper in front of me, because it took a lot of sweat to come up with a difference, really. I think there's some obvious things you can say that help to distinguish one from the other. There's often a stochastic element in the predicted values, or let's say simulated values, from a modeling and simulation project, which usually are not there when you're just looking at model predicted values per se. So some perturbation is done according to the expected distribution of the outcome, say. So that's one obvious difference. Another, which is more difficult to express, is that, and which is really valuable in my eyes for modeling and simulation, is where you the outcomes you simulate are of a variety and of a kind which wouldn't necessarily occur in from the situation from which you created your model. So you're able to, as it were, manufacture modeled worlds in your simulation, which might involve interactions which wouldn't occur in the real world. So it's that element of extending outside the source of the model, which helps to distinguish a modeling and simulation project in my eyes. So those are two elements: the stochastic element, and then the going outside in terms of complexity or in terms of extrapolation, going outside the source from which the model was estimated. Kathy, would you have any other differences that you would see between simple modeling with predicted values versus what we call modeling and simulation? Yeah.
it's a too complicated question for me.
Well, on my view, for example, I think that, of course, it's the complexity of the project and modeling and simulation in general. It may include really, as Michael told, many different parts and different methods, etc. But on my opinion, if you can just use statistical model and use some estimated parameters or predicted values, it may be considered like just a part of modeling simulation project. That's it. That means, from me, it's not much difference like between simpler and more complicated, something like this. Yeah. Okay, so there are a couple of questions, but I see they actually were answered already, like pros and cons of modeling and simulation, practical tips about practice of modeling and simulation. I don't know if, but in interest of time, I think we should go to the end. And of course, all attendees, they may ask by email directly speakers or PSI organizers about it. And I give a floor to Marian from PSI group about announcement.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much, Vlad. So I just, on behalf of the organising committee today, we'd like to thank the presenters and the chair for a very enjoyable and informative meeting. Thank you so much. And we'd also like to draw everyone's attention to future PSI events, and everyone's very welcome to attend. And we draw the meeting to a close. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to speakers again.